Franz Halder sat in the hushed, sterile atmosphere of the Oberkommando des Heeres, his pen scratching across maps that depicted the Soviet Union not as a continent, but as a series of geometric problems to be solved. To the Prussian military mind, space was merely a variable of time and velocity. On the high-quality vellum spread across his desk, the Soviet Union looked remarkably fragile. 3 massive army groups north, center, and south represented nearly 4 million men. A steel tide poised to break against the dikes of Bolshevism. The plan, Operation Barbarossa, was a masterpiece of traditional staff work. It envisioned a swift, decapitating blow that would shatter the Red Army in the border regions, followed by a triumphant stroll to the O-line, stretching from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan. On paper, it was the greatest military symphony ever composed. In reality, it was a suicide note written in exquisite calligraphy. The delusion began with the maps themselves. German cartographers, working from outdated tourist surveys and aerial reconnaissance that failed to capture the true nightmare of the interior, saw roads where there were only tracks of pulverized dirt. They saw bridges where there were rotted wooden planks incapable of supporting a 10-ton Panzer III. Most faithfully, they saw a finite enemy. Intelligence estimates suggested the Soviets could muster perhaps 200 divisions. By the second month of the invasion, the Germans had identified 360. For every Soviet army crushed in a spectacular pocket at Minsk or Smolensk, 2 more seemed to rise from the very soil, manned by teenagers and factory workers clutching rifles, caked in storage grease. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the sensory reality of the invasion was a deafening, rhythmic thunder. The smell of high-octane fuel and the acrid bite of cordite filled the air as thousands of engines roared to life. At first, the exhilaration of the blitzkrieg masked the rot at the core of the machine. Tank commanders, perched in their cupolas, watched the Russian steppe unfold like a golden ocean. They were moving at 40 kilometers a day, outrunning their own communications, basking in the sun of what felt like an inevitable victory. But beneath the floorboards of the panzers, the mechanical reality was already beginning to shift. The German Wehrmacht was not the fully mechanized monolith of propaganda. It was a horse-drawn army with a thin, shimmering veneer of motorization. For every truck, there were 10 horses. As the heat of the Russian summer intensified, the fine, talcum-like dust of the east began to do what the Red Army could not. It choked the air filters of the sophisticated Maybach engines. It ground down the bearings of the Opel Blitz trucks. It worked its way into the lungs of the infantrymen, who marched 30 miles a day in wool tunics, their faces masked by gray dust until they looked like ghosts haunting the very land they were trying to conquer. By July, the logistics began to scream. A single panzer division required 30 tons of fuel and ammunition every day, just to maintain a stationary existence, and hundreds of tons to keep moving. The supply lines were stretching like a rubber band reaching its snapping point. The rail gauges in the Soviet Union were wider than those in Europe, meaning every ton of bread, every shell, and every drop of oil had to be offloaded at the border and reloaded onto captured Soviet trains or labored into the back of trucks that were already falling apart in the rear. The mechanics were the unsung witnesses to the coming catastrophe. They knelt in the mud, their fingernails permanently blackened, trying to cannibalize parts from French, British, and Czech trucks to fix German machines. The Wehrmacht was using over 1,000 different types of vehicles, each requiring its own specific gaskets, spark plugs, and fan belts. It was a maintenance nightmare that no amount of Prussian discipline could organize. The soldiers on the ground felt the shift before the generals in East Prussia did. The vastness of Russia began to exert a psychological pressure. A private in the 18th Panzer Division might look at his map and see he had traveled 300 miles, only to look at the horizon and see the same endless line of birch trees and sunflowers. The silence of the steppe at night was heavy, broken only by the distant, mournful lowing of abandoned cattle or the crackle of a village being put to the torch. The human element was being ground away by the sheer scale of the task. They were winning battles, winning them decisively, yet the war felt no closer to ending. They would take 20,000 prisoners in an afternoon, only to find a fresh Soviet division entrenched 10 miles further east the next morning. Then came the rain. In late September, the Rasputits of the season of quagmires arrived. The Russian soil, a rich, black earth, turned into a viscous glue. The roads simply ceased to exist. Tanks sank to their bellies. Horses strained until their hearts burst, dying in the harnesses. Their carcasses left to rot in the rising slush. A supply column that could cover 50 miles in a day during July now struggled to move 5. Soldiers spent more time digging out wheels than they did fighting. The grit was no longer a metaphor. It was the physical state of their existence. It was in their food, their wounds, and their eyes. The German High Command, blinded by the perceived collapse of the Soviet state, ordered one last push, Operation Typhoon. The goal was Moscow. But the army that turned toward the Soviet capital was a shadow of the force that had crossed the border in June. The tanks were worn out, their tracks rattling with a loose, metallic clank that signaled imminent failure. The men were exhausted, their uniforms tattered, their boots worn through. And then, the temperature dropped. The transition from the mud to the deep freeze happened with a terrifying speed. In early November, the ground hardened, which briefly allowed the panzers to move again, but it was a cruel gift. The mercury plummeted to 20, 30, and then 40 degrees below zero. The German army had been issued no winter clothing. The leadership had been so certain of a summer victory that the heavy coats and fur hats remained in warehouses in Poland, unable to reach the front because the tracks were clogged with ammunition and food. Now, the logistics of survival replaced the logistics of conquest. Soldiers stripped the silk from captured Soviet parachutes to wrap around their faces. They stuffed newspapers into their tunics to create a layer of insulation. The oil in the panzers froze into a solid, glass-like substance. To start a tank, crews had to light small fires beneath the engines, a dangerous and desperate ritual that filled the morning air with thick, oily smoke. If a man touched a piece of metal with his bare hand, the skin stayed behind. Frostbite became a greater threat than Soviet snipers. Thousands of men underwent amputations in field hospitals that were little more than unheated basements. The surgeons working by candlelight with saws that grew dull from overuse. On the outskirts of Moscow, the German spearheads could see the golden spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were at the very limit of human and mechanical endurance. They were out of fuel, out of luck, and out of time. On December 5th, the temperature hit a record low, and the Red Army, fresh, well-equipped, and acclimated to the boreal hell, launched its counteroffensive. The Siberian divisions, clad in white quilted uniforms and skiing through the drifts, looked like vengeful spirits. The German soldiers, frozen in their foxholes, their rifles jammed by frozen grease, could only watch as the paper-thin logic of their leaders finally tore apart. In the end, the failure of Barbarossa wasn't found in a single lost battle or a specific tactical error. It was found in the hubris of the ledger. It was the belief that the messiness of humanity, the friction of geography, and the stubborn reality of physics could be overcome by the sheer will of the master race. As the remnants of the Wehrmacht began their long, agonizing retreat through the snow, the landscape they had sought to own became their shroud. The horses were eaten. The trucks were abandoned as steel monuments to a dead philosophy. And the men who survived carried with them a haunting realization. They had not been defeated by a superior strategy, but by the simple, crushing weight of a world that refused to fit into Franz Halder's geometric boxes. The silence of the Russian winter was the final, unarguable critique of a plan that had looked perfect on a desk in Berlin.